CHAPTER V. Of Black Ivory, by R.M. Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER V. In which the travellers enjoy themselves extremely, and Disco Lillihammer sees several astonishing sights. Behold our travellers, then, fairly embarked on the waters of the great African river Zambesi, in two canoes, one of which is commanded by Harold Seadrift, the other by Disco Lillihammer. Of course these enterprising chiefs were modest enough at first to allow two of the Makololo men, Jumbo and Zombo, to wield the steering oars, but after a few days' practice they became sufficiently expert, as Disco said, to take the helm, except when strong currents rendered the navigation difficult, or when the weather became so piping hot that none but men clad in black skins could work. We must, however, guard the reader here from supposing that it is always piping hot in Africa. There are occasional days when the air may be styled lukewarm, when the sky is serene, and when all nature seems joyful and enjoyable; days in which a man opens his mouth wide and swallows down the atmosphere, when he feels his health and strength, and rejoices in them, and when, if he be not an infidel, he also feels a sensation of gratitude to the Giver of all good. On such a day, soon after entering the East Luavo mouth of the Zambesi, the explorers, for such we may almost venture to style them, ascended the smooth stream close to the left bank, Harold leading, Disco following closely in his wake. The men rowed gently, as if they enjoyed the sweet calm of early morning, and were unwilling to disturb the innumerable flocks of wild fowl that chuckled among the reeds and sedges everywhere. Harold sat in the stern, leaning back, and only dipping the steering oar lazily now and then to keep the canoe from running on the bank, or plunging into a forest of gigantic rushes. Disco, having resolved to solace himself with a whiff of his darling pipe, had resigned the helm to Jumbo, and laid himself in a position of comfort which admitted of his resting his head on the gunwale in such a manner that, out of the corners of his eyes, he could gaze down into the water. The part of the river they had reached was so perfectly still that every cloud in the sky, every mangrove, root and spray, and every bending bulrush was perfectly reproduced in the reflected world below. Plaintive cries of wild fowl formed appropriate melody, to which chattering groups of monkeys and croaking bullfrogs contributed a fine tenor and bass. "Hallo, Disco!" exclaimed Harold in a subdued key, looking over his shoulder. "Ay, ay, sir," sighed the seaman, without moving his position. "Range up alongside. I want to speak to you." "Ay, ay, sir." "Jumbo, you black-faced villain, d'ee hear that? Give way and go 'longside." Good humoured Jumbo spoke very little English, but had come to understand a good deal during his travels with Dr Livingstone. He wrinkled his visage and showed his brilliant teeth on receiving the order. Muttering a word to the men and giving a vigorous stroke, he shot up alongside of the leader's canoe. "You seem comfortable," said Harold with a laugh, as Disco's vast visage appeared at his elbow. "I is." "Isn't this jolly?" continued Harold. "No, sir, 'tain't." "Why, what do you mean?" "I means that jolly ain't the word, by a long way, for to express the natur' o' my feelin's. There ain't no word as I knows on as 'ud come up to it. If I wor a philosopher, now, I'd coin a word for the occasion. P'raps," continued Disco, drawing an unusually long whiff from his pipe, "p'raps, not bein' a philosopher, I might nevertheless try to coin one. Wot's the Latin, now, for heaven?" "Caelum," replied Harold. "Salem, huh? An' wot's the 'arth?" "Terra." "Terra! Well, now, wot ridiculous names to give to 'em," said Disco, shaking his head gravely. "I can't see why the ancients couldn't have bin satisfied with the name that we've given 'em. Hows'ever, that's neither here nor there. My notion o' the state o' things that we've got into here as they now stand is, that they are Salem Terracious, which means heaven upon earth. D'ee see?" As Disco pronounced the word with a powerful emphasis on the part of it, the sound was rather effective, and seemed to please him. "Say, you're right, or nearly so," replied Harold, "but don't you think the word savours too much of perfection, seeing that breakfast would add to the pleasure of the present delightful state of things, and make them even more sailumterracious than they are." "No, sir, no, the word ain't too parfect," replied Disco, with a look of critical severity. "Part of it is 'arth, and 'arth is imparfect, bein' susceptible of a many improvements, among which undoubtedly is breakfast, likewise dinner and supper, to say nothin' of lunch and tea, which is suitable only for babies and women. So I agree with you, sir, that the state of things will be sailumterraciouser if we goes ashore and has breakfast." He tapped the head of his very black little pipe on the edge of the canoe, and heaved a sigh of contentment as he watched the ash ball that floated away on the stream. Then, rousing himself, he seized the steering oar and followed Harold into a small creek, which was pleasantly overshadowed by the rich tropical foliage of that region. While breakfast was being prepared by Antonio, whose talents as chef de cuisine were of the highest order, Harold took his rifle and rambled into the bush in search of game. Any kind of game, for at that time he had had no experience whatever of the sport afforded by the woods of tropical Africa, and having gathered only a few vague ideas from books, he went forth with all the pleasurable excitement and expectation that we may suppose peculiar to discoverers. Disco Lillihammer having only consumed his first pipe of tobacco, and holding it to be a duty which he vowed to himself to consume 2 before breakfast, remained at the camp fire to smoke and chaff Antonio, whose good nature was only equalled by his activity. "What have 'ee got there?" inquired Disco, as Antonio poured a quantity of seed into a large pot. "Dis? Vy, hims be mapira," replied the interpreter, with a benignant smile. "Hims de chief food ob dis country." It must be remarked here that Antonio's English, having been acquired from all sorts of persons in nearly every tropical part of the globe, was somewhat of a jumble, being a compound of the broken English spoken by individuals among the Germans, French, Portuguese, Arabs, and negroes, with whom he had at various times associated, modified by his own ignorance, and seasoned with a dash of his own inventive fancy. "Is it good?" asked Disco. "Goot!" exclaimed Antonio. Being unable to find words to express himself, the enthusiastic cook placed his hand on the region which was destined ere long to become a receptacle for the mapira, and rolled his eyes upwards in rapture. "Ha! oo sall see behind long." "Before long, you mean," observed the seaman. "Dat all the same ting, s'long's you onerstand him," replied Antonio complacently. "Bring vater now, Jumbo. Put him in careful, not spill on de fire. So, goot!" Jumbo filled up the kettle carefully, and a broad grin overspread his black visage, partly because he was easily tickled into a condition of risibility by the cool off hand remarks of Disco Lillihammer, and partly because, having acquired his own small spattering of English from Dr Livingstone, he was intelligent enough to perceive that in regard to Antonio's language there was something peculiar. "Now go fitch 'noder kittle, queek." "Yes, sar, so goot," replied Jumbo, mimicking the interpreter, and going off with a vociferous laugh at his little joke, in which he was joined by his sable clansmen, Masiko and Zombo. "Hims got 'nuff of impoodidence," said the interpreter, as he bustled about his avocations. "He's not the only one that's got more than enough impoodidence," said Disco, pushing a fine straw down the stem of his cutty to make it draw better. "I say, Tony," our regardless seaman had already thus mutilated his name, "you seem to have plenty live stock in them parts." "Plenty vat?" inquired the interpreter, with a perplexed expression. "Why, plenty birds and beasts. Live stock we calls it, meanin' thereby livin' creeturs." He pointed towards an opening in the mangroves, through which were visible the neighbouring mud and salt flats, swarming with wild fowl, and conspicuous among which were large flocks of pelicans, who seemed to be gorging themselves comfortably from an apparently inexhaustible supply of fish in the pools left by the receding tide. "Ho, yes, me perceive, yes, plenty bird and beast, fishes too, and crabs, look dere." He pointed to a part of the sands nearest to their encampment which appeared to be alive with some small creatures. "That's coorious," said Disco, removing his pipe and regarding the phenomenon with some interest. "No tink coorious, it's quabs," replied Antonio. "Crabs is it?" said Disco, rising and sauntering down to the sands, for he possessed an inquiring mind, with a special tendency to investigate the habits, pranks as he called them, of the lower animals, which in other circumstances might have made him a naturalist. Muttering to himself he was fond of muttering to himself, it felt companionable "Curious, very curious, quite 'stroordinary," he crept stealthily to the edge of the mangroves, and there discovered that the sands were literally alive with myriads of minute crabs, which were actively engaged, it was supposed by those who ought to know best, in gathering their food. The moment the tide ebbed from any part of the sands, out came these crablets in swarms, and set to work, busy as bees, ploughing up the sand and sifting it, apparently for food, until the whole flat was rendered rough by their incessant labours. Approaching cautiously, Disco observed that each crab, as he went along sideways, gathered a round bit of moist sand at its mouth, which was quickly brushed away by one of his claws, and replaced by another and another, as fast as they could be brushed aside. "Eatin' sand they are," muttered Disco in surprise; but presently the improbability of sand being very nutritious food, even for crabs, forced itself on him, and he muttered his conviction that they was "scrapin' for victuals." Having watched the crabs a considerable time, and observed that they frequently interrupted their labours to dart suddenly into their holes and out again, for the purpose, he conjectured, of "havin' a drop o' summat to wet their whistles," Disco thrust the cutty into his vest pocket, and walked a little further out on the flat in the hope of discovering some new objects of interest. Nor was he disappointed. Besides finding that the pools left by the tide swarmed with varieties of little fish, many of them being curious, he was fortunate enough to witness a most surprising combat. It happened thus. Perceiving, a little to his right, some small creature hopping about on the sand near to a little pool, he turned aside to observe it more closely. On his drawing near, the creature jumped into the pool. Disco advanced to the edge, gazing intently into the water, and saw nothing except his own reflected image at the bottom. Presently the creature reappeared. It was a small fish, a familiar fish too, which he had known in the pools of his native land by the name of blenny. As the blenny appeared to wish to approach the edge of the pool, Disco retired, and, placing a hand on each knee, stooped, in order to make himself as small as possible. He failed, the diminution in his height being fully counterbalanced by the latitudinal extension of his elbows. Presently the blenny put its head out of the water and looked about. We speak advisedly. The blenny is altogether a singular and exceptional fish. It can, and does, look sidewise, upwards and downwards, with its protruding eyes, as knowingly and with as much vivacity as if it were a human being. This power in a fish has something of the same awesome effect on an observer as might possibly result were a horse to raise its head and smile at him. Seeing that the coast was clear, for Disco stood as motionless as a mangrove tree, the blenny hopped upon the dry land. The African blenny is a sort of amphibious animal, living nearly as much out of the water as in it. Indeed, its busiest time, we are told, (see Dr Livingstone's Zambesi and its Tributaries, page 843), is at low water, when by means of its pectoral fins it crawls out on the sand and raises itself into something of a standing attitude, with its bright eyes keeping a sharp look out for the light coloured flies on which it feeds. For several seconds Disco gazed at the fish, and the fish gazed around, even turning its head a little, as well as its eyes, on this side and on that. Presently a small fly, with that giddy heedlessness which characterises the race, alighted about 2 inches in front of blenny's nose. Instantly the fish leaped that vast space, alighted with its underset mouth just over the fly, which immediately rose into it, and was entombed. "Brayvo!" passed through Disco's brain, but no sound issued from his lips. Presently another of the giddy ones alighted in front of blenny about a foot distant. This appeared to be much beyond his leaping powers, for, with a slow, stealthy motion, like a cat, he began deliberately to stalk his victim. The victim appeared to be blind, for it took no notice of the approaching monster. Blenny displayed marvellous powers of self control, for he moved on steadily without accelerating his speed until within about 2 inches of his prey, Then he leapt as before, and another fly was entombed. "Well done!" exclaimed Disco, mentally, but still his lips and body were motionless as before. At this point an enemy in the shape of another blenny appeared on the scene. It came up out of a small pool close at hand, and seemed to covet the first blenny's pool, and to set about taking possession of it as naturally as if it had been a human being, for, observing, no doubt, that its neighbour was busily engaged, it moved quietly in the direction of the coveted pool. Being a very little fish, it was not observed by Disco, but it was instantly noticed by the first blenny, which, being rather the smaller of the two, we shall style the little one. Suddenly Big Blenny threw off all disguise, bounded towards the pool, which was about a foot square, and plunged in. No mortal blenny could witness this unwarrantable invasion of its hearth and home without being stirred to indignant wrath. With eyes that seemed to flash fire, and dorsal fin bristling up with rage, Little Blenny made 5 tremendous leaps of full 3 inches each, and disappeared. Another moment and a miniature storm ruffled the pool. For a few seconds the heavings of the deep were awful. Then out jumped Big Blenny and tried to flee, but out jumped Little Blenny and caught him by the tail. Round turned the big one and caught the other by the jaw. "Hallo, Disco! Breakfast ready! Where are you?" shouted Harold from the woods. Disco replied not. It is a question whether he heard the hail at all, so engrossed was he in this remarkable fight. "Brayvo!" he exclaimed aloud, when Little Blenny shook his big enemy off and rolled him over. "Cleverly done!" he shouted, when Big Blenny with the dark took refuge in the pool. "I knowed it!" he cried approvingly, when Little Blenny forced him a second time to evacuate the premises. "Go in and win, little 'un," thought Disco. Thus the battle raged furiously, now in the water, now on the sand, while the excited seamen danced round the combatants, both of whom appeared to have become deaf and blind with rage, and gave them strong encouragement, mingled with appropriate advice and applause. In fact, Disco's delight would have been perfect, had the size of the belligerents admitted of his patting the Little Blenny on the back, but this of course was out of the question. At last, having struck, worried, bitten, and chased each other by land and sea for several minutes, these pugnacious creatures seized each other by their respective throats, like 2 bulldogs, and fell exhausted on the sand. "It's a draw!" exclaimed Disco, rather disappointed. "No, 'tain't," he said, as Little Blenny, reviving, rose up and renewed the combat more furiously than ever. But it was soon ended, for Big Blenny suddenly turned and fled to his own pool. Little Blenny did not crow. He did not even appear to be elated. He evidently felt that he had been called on to perform a disagreeable but unavoidable duty, and deemed it quite unnecessary to wave banners, fire guns, or ring bells in celebration of his victory, as he dived back into his pool amid the ringing cheers of Disco Lillihammer. "Upon my word, if you have not gone stark mad, you must have had a sunstroke," said Harold, coming forward. "What's the matter?" "Too late! Too late!" cried Disco, in a mingled tone of amusement and regret. "D'ye think it is? Are you incurable already?" asked his friend. "Too late to see the most astonishin' scrimmage I ever did behold in my life," said Disco. The description of this scrimmage gave the worthy seaman a subject for conversation, and food for meditation during the greater part of the time spent over the morning meal, and there is no saying how long he would have kept referring to and chuckling over it, to the great admiration and sympathy of the black fellows, who are, as a race, excessively fond of jocularity and fun, had not another of the denizens of the mangrove jungle diverted his attention and thoughts rather suddenly. This was a small monkey, which, seated on a branch overhead, peered at the breakfast party from among the leaves with an expression of inquiry and of boundless astonishment that it is quite impossible to describe. Surprise of the most sprightly nature, if we may say so, sat enthroned on that small monkey's countenance, an expression which was enhanced by the creature's motions, for, not satisfied with taking a steady look at the intruders from the right side of a leaf, it thrust forward its little black head on the left side of it, and then under it, by way of variety. But no additional light seemed to result from these changes in the point of observation, for the surprise did not diminish. In one of its intent stares it caught the eye of Disco. The seaman's jaws stopped as if suddenly locked, and his eyes opened to their widest. The monkey seemed to feel uneasily that it had attracted attention, for it showed the smallest possible glimpse of its teeth. The action, coupled with the leafy shadows which fell on its countenance, had the effect of a smile, which caused Disco to burst into a loud laugh and point upwards. To bound from its position to a safer retreat, and thence stare at Disco with deep indignation and a threatening display of all its teeth and gums, in addition to its looks of surprise, was the work of a moment on the part of the small monkey, whereat Disco burst into a renewed roar of laughter, in which he was joined by the whole party. "Are there many o' them fellows hereabouts?" inquired the seaman of Antonio. "Ho, yis, lots of dem. Tousands everywheres. See, dere are more." He pointed to another part of the umbrageous canopy overhead, where the face of a still smaller monkey was visible, engaged, like the previous one, in an earnest scrutiny of the party, but with a melancholy rather than a surprised expression of visage. "Wot a miserable broken hearted thing!" said Disco, grinning, in which act he was immediately copied by the melancholy monkey, though from different motives. Disco was very fond of monkeys. All his life he had felt a desire to pat and fondle those shivering creatures which he had been accustomed to see on barrel organs in his native land, and the same strong impulse came over him now. "Wot a pity the critters smell so bad, and ain't cleanly," he remarked, gazing affectionately up among the leaves. "They'd make such capital pets. Why, there's another!" This remark had reference to a third monkey, of large dimensions and fierce countenance, which at that moment rudely thrust the melancholy monkey aside and took its place. The latter, with a humble air and action, took up a new position, somewhat nearer to the fire, where its sad countenance was more distinctly seen. "Well, it does seem a particularly sorrowful monkey, that," said Harold, laughing, as he helped himself to another canful of tea. "The most miserable object I ever did see," observed Disco. The negroes looked at each other and laughed. They were accustomed to monkeys, and took little notice of them, but they were mightily tickled by Disco's amusement, for he had laid down his knife and fork, and shook a good deal with internal chuckling as he gazed upwards. "One would suppose, now," he said softly, "that it had recently seen its father and mother, and all its brothers and sisters, removed by a violent death, or sold into slavery." "Ha! they never see that," said Harold. "The brutes may fight and kill, but they never enslave each other. It is the proud prerogative of man to do that." "That's true, sir, worse luck, as Paddy says," rejoined Disco. "But look there, wot's them coorious things round the creetur's waist? A pair o' the werry smallest hands, and hallo! a face no bigger than a button. I do believe that it's " Disco did not finish the sentence, but he was right. The small melancholy monkey was a mother. Probably that was the cause of its sorrow. It is a touching thought that anxiety for its tiny offspring perhaps had furrowed that monkey's visage with the wrinkles of premature old age. That danger threatened it on every side was obvious, for no sooner had it taken up its new position, after its unceremonious ejection by the fierce monkey, than the sprightly monkey before referred to conceived a plot which it immediately proceeded to carry into execution. Observing that the tail of the sad one hung down in a clear space below the branch on which it sat, the sprightly fellow quickly, but with intense caution and silence, crept towards it, and when within a yard or so sprang into the air and caught the tail. A wild shriek, and what Disco styled a scrimmage, ensued, during which the mother monkey gave chase to him of the lively visage, using her arms, legs, and tail promiscuously to grasp and hold on to branches, and leaving her extremely little one to look out for itself. This it seemed quite capable of doing, for no limpet ever stuck to a solid rock with greater tenacity than did that infant to the maternal waist throughout the chase. The hubbub appeared to startle the whole monkey race, revealing the fact that troops of other monkeys had, unobserved, been gazing at the strangers in silent wonder since the time of their landing. Pleasant, however, though this state of things undeniably was, it could not be expected to last. Breakfast being concluded, it became necessary that Disco should tear himself from the spot, which, having first solaced himself with a pipe, he did with a good grace, remarking, as he re embarked and took the helm of his canoe, that he had got more powerful surprises that morning than he had ever before experienced in any previous 12 month of his life. Before long he received many more surprises, especially one of a very different and much less pleasant nature, an account of which will be found in the next chapter. Chapter 5. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Of Black Ivory by R. M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 describes several new and surprising incidents, which must be read to be fully appreciated. To travel with one's mouth and eyes open to nearly their utmost width in a state of surprised stupefaction may be unavoidable, but it cannot be said to be either becoming or convenient. Attention in such a case is apt to be diverted from the business in hand, and flies have a tendency to immolate themselves in the throat. Nevertheless, inconvenient though the condition was, our friend Disco Lillihammer was so afflicted with astonishment at what he heard and saw in this new land that he was constantly engaged in swallowing flies and running his canoe among shallows and rushes, insomuch that he at last resigned the steering oar until familiarity with present circumstances should tone him down to a safe condition of equanimity. And no wonder that Disco was surprised. No wonder that his friend Harold Seadrift shared in his astonishment and delight, for they were at once, and for the first time in their lives, plunged into the very heart of jungle life in equatorial Africa. Those who have never wandered far from the comparatively tame regions of our temperate zone can form but a faint conception of what it is to ramble in the tropics, and therefore can scarcely be expected to sympathise fully with the mental condition of our heroes as they ascended the Zambesi. Everything was so thoroughly strange, sights and sounds so vastly different from what they had been accustomed to see and hear, that it seemed as though they had landed on another planet. Trees, shrubs, flowers, birds, beasts, insects, and reptiles, all were unfamiliar, except indeed one or two of the more conspicuous trees and animals, which had been so imprinted on their minds by means of nursery picture books that, on first beholding them, Disco unconsciously paid these books the compliment of saying that the animals was uncommon like the picturs. Disco's mental condition may be said, for the first 2 or 3 days, to have been one of gentle ever-flowing surprise, studded thickly with little bursts of keen astonishment. The first part of the river ran between mangrove jungle, in regard to which he remarked that "them there trees had legs like crabs," in which observation he was not far wrong, for when the tide was out the roots of the mangroves rose high out of the mud, forming supports, as it were, for the trees to stand on. But it was the luxuriance of the vegetation that made the most powerful impression on the travellers. It seemed as if the various groups and families of the vegetable kingdom had been warmed by the sun into a state of unwonted affection, for everything appeared to entertain the desire to twine round and embrace everything else. One magnificent screw palm in particular was so overwhelmed by affectionate parasites that his natural shape was almost entirely concealed. Others of the trees were decked with orchilla weed. There were ferns so gigantic as to be almost worthy of being styled trees, and palm bushes so sprawling as to suggest the idea of huge vegetable spiders. Bright yellow fruit gleamed among the graceful green leaves of the mangroves, while date palms gave variety to the scene, if that had been needed, which it was not, and masses of umbrageous plants with large yellow flowers grew along the banks, while down among the underwood giant roots rose in fantastic convolutions above ground, as if the earth were already too full, and there wasn't room for the whole of them. There was an antediluvian magnificence, a prehistoric snakiness, a sort of primeval running to seedness, which filled Harold and Disco with feelings of awe, and induced a strange, almost unnatural tendency to regard Adam and Eve as their contemporaries. Animal life was not wanting in this paradise. Frequently did our seaman give vent to "Hallo! There they go!" "Look out for the little 'un with the long tail!" and similar expressions, referring, of course, to his favourite monkeys, which ever and anon peered out upon the strangers with looks of intensity, for whatever their expression might be sadness, grief, interrogation, wrath, surprise it was always in the superlative degree. There were birds also innumerable. One, styled the king hunter, sang wild exultant airs, as if it found king hunting to be an extremely exhilarating occupation, though what sort of kings it hunted we cannot tell. Perhaps it was the king of beasts, perhaps the kingfisher, a bright specimen of which was frequently seen to dart out from the banks, but we profess ignorance on this point. There were fish hawks also, magnificent fellows which sat in regal dignity on the tops of the mangrove trees, and the glossy ibis, with others of the feathered tribe too numerous to mention. Large animals also were there in abundance, though not so frequently seen as those which have been already mentioned. Disco occasionally made known the fact that such or something unusual had transpired, by the sudden and violent exclamation of "What's that?" in a voice so loud that, whatever it might be, sometimes bolted or took to flight before any one else caught sight of it. "Hallo!" he exclaimed, on one such occasion, as the canoes turned a bend of the river. "What now?" demanded Harold, looking at his companion to observe the direction of his eyes. "I'm a Dutchman!" exclaimed Disco in a hoarse whisper that might have been heard half a mile off, "if it's not a zebra." "So it is. My rifle. Look sharp!" said Harold eagerly. The weapon was handed to him, but before it could be brought to bear, the beautiful striped creature had tossed its head, snorted, whisked its tail, kicked up its heels, and dashed into the jungle. "Give way, lads! Let's after him!" shouted Disco, turning the canoe's bow to shore. "Hold on!" cried Harold. "You might as well go after a needle in a haystack or a locomotive." "So I might," admitted Disco, with a mortified air, resuming his course, "but it ain't no reason to expect a feller to keep quiet when he sees one o' the very picturs of his childhood, so to speak, come alive, and kick up its heels like that." Buffaloes were also seen in the grassy glades, but it proved difficult to come within range of them; also wart hogs and 3 different kinds of antelope. Of these last Harold shot several, and they were found to be excellent food. Human beings were also observed, but those first encountered fled at the sight of the white men, as if they had met with their worst foes; and such was in very truth the case, if we may regard the Portuguese half castes of that coast as white men, for these negroes were runaway slaves, who stood the chance of being shot, or drowned, or whipped to death, if recaptured. Other animals they saw, some queer, some terrible, nearly all strange, and last, though not least, the hippopotamus. When Disco first saw this ungainly monster, he was bereft of speech for some minutes. The usual "Hallo!" stuck in his throat, and well nigh choked him. He could only gasp and point. "Ay, there goes a hippopotamus," said Harold, with the easy nonchalance of a man who had been to the Zoological Gardens, and knew all about it. Nevertheless it was quite plain that Harold was much excited, for he almost dropped his oar overboard in making a hasty grasp at his rifle. Before he could fire, the creature gaped wide, as if in laughter, and dived. "Unfortunate!" said Harold, in a philosophically careless tone. "Never mind, we shall see lots more of them." "Ugliness embodied," said Disco, heaving a deep sigh. "But him's goot for eat," said Antonio, smacking his lips. "Is he?" demanded Disco of Jumbo, whose enjoyment of the sailor's expressive looks was so great that, whenever the latter opened his lips, the former looked back over his shoulder with a broad grin of expectation. "Ho, yes, de hippopotamus am fust rate grub for dis yere boy," replied the negro, rolling his red tongue inside his mouth suggestively. "He never eats man, does he?" inquired Disco. "Nevair," replied Antonio. "He looks as if he might," returned the seaman. "Anyhow, he's got a mouth big enough to do it. You're quite sure he don't, I s'pose?" "Kite sure an' sartin, but me hab seen him tak mans," said Antonio. "Tak mans! What d'ye mean by that?" "Tak him," repeated Antonio. "Go at him's canoe or boat, bump with him's head, dash in de timbers, capsize, so's mans hab to swim shore, all as got clear ob de crokidils." While Disco was meditating on this unpleasant trait of character in the hippopotamus, the specimen which they had just seen, or some other member of his family, having compassion, no doubt, on the seaman's ignorance, proceeded to illustrate its method of attack then and there, by suddenly rising under the canoe with such force that its head and shoulders shot high out of the water, into which it fell with a heavy splash. Harold's rifle being ready, he fired just as it was disappearing. Whether he hit it or not is uncertain, but next moment the enraged animal rose again under Disco's canoe, which it nearly lifted out of the water in its efforts to seize it in its mouth. Fortunately the canoe was too flat for its jaws to grip. The monster's blunt teeth were felt, as well as heard, to grind across the planks, and Disco, being in the stern, which was raised highest, was almost thrown overboard by the jerk. Rising about 2 yards off, the hippopotamus looked savagely at the canoe, and was about to dive again when Harold gave it a second shot. The large gun being fortunately ready, had been handed to him by one of the Makololo men. The heavy ball took effect behind the eye, and killed the animal almost instantaneously. The hippopotamus usually sinks when shot dead, but in this case they were so near that, before it had time to sink, Zombo, assisted by his friend Jumbo, made a line fast to it, and it was finally dragged to the shore. The landing, however, was much retarded by the crocodiles, which now showed themselves for the first time, and kept tugging and worrying the carcass much as a puppy tugs and worries a lady's muff, affording Disco and his friend strong reason to congratulate themselves that the canoe had not been overturned. The afternoon was pretty well advanced when the landing was accomplished on a small sandy island, and as the spot was suitable for encamping, they determined to remain there for the night, and feast. There are many points of resemblance between savage and civilised festivities. Whether the performers be the black sons of Africa, or the white fathers of Europe, there is the same powerful tendency to eat too much, and the same display of good fellowship, for it is an indisputable fact that feeding man is amiable, unless, indeed, he be dyspeptic. There are also, however, various points of difference. The savage, owing to the amount of fresh air and exercise which he is compelled to take, usually eats with greater appetite, and knows nothing of equine dreams or sleepless nights. On the whole, we incline to the belief that, despite his lack of refinement and ceremony, the savage has the best of it in this matter. Disco Lillihammer's visage, during the progress of that feast, formed a study worthy of a physiognomist. Every new achievement, whether trifling or important, performed by the Makololo triad, Jumbo, Zombo, and Masiko, every fresh hippopotamus steak skewered and set up to roast by the half caste brothers Jose and Oliveira, every lick bestowed on their greasy fingers by the Somali negroes, Nakoda and Konda, and every sign of intense satisfaction heaved by the so called freemen of Quillimane, Zongolo, and Mabruki, was watched, commented on, and, if we may say so, reflected in the animated countenance of the stout seaman, with such variety of expression, and such an interesting compound of grin and wrinkle, that poor Jumbo, who gazed at him over hippopotamus ribs and steak, and tried hard not to laugh, was at last compelled to turn away his eyes in order that his mouth might have fair play. But wonderful, sumptuous, and every way satisfactory though that feast was, it bore no comparison whatever to another feast carried on at the same time by another party, about 50 yards off, where the carcass of the hippopotamus had been left half in and half out of the water, for of course being fully more than a ton in weight, only a small portion of the creature was appropriated by the canoemen. The negroes paid no attention whatever to this other festive party, but in a short time Disco turned his head to one side and said, "Why, wot's that splashin' I hears goin' on over there?" "I suspect it must be some beast or other that has got hold of the carcass," replied Harold, who was himself busy with a portion of the same. "Yis, dat am crokidils got him," said Antonio, with his mouth full, very full. "You don't say so!" said Disco, washing down the steak with a brimming cup of tea. No one appeared to think it worth while to asseverate the fact, for it was self-evident. Several crocodiles were supping, and in doing so they tore away at the carcass with such violence, and lashed the water so frequently with their powerful tails, as to render it clear that their feast necessitated laborious effort, and seemed less a recreation than a duty. Moreover, they sat at their meat like insatiable gourmands, so long into the night that supper became transmuted into breakfast, and Harold's rest was greatly disturbed thereby. He was too sleepy and lazy, however, to rise and drive them away. Next morning the travellers started early, being anxious to pass, as quietly as possible, a small Portuguese town, near to which, it was said, a party of runaway slaves and rebels against the Government were engaged in making depredations. When grey dawn was beginning to rise above the tree tops, they left their encampment in profound silence, and rowed up stream as swiftly as possible. They had not advanced far when, on turning a point covered with tall reeds, Zombo, who was bowman in the leading canoe, suddenly made a sign to the men to cease rowing. "What's the matter?" whispered Harold. The negro pointed through the reeds, and whispered the single word, "Canoe." By this time the other canoe had ranged up alongside, and after a brief consultation between Harold and Disco, it was decided that they should push gently into the reeds and wait till the strange canoe should pass. But a few seconds sufficed to show that the two men who paddled it did not intend to pass down the river, for they pushed straight out towards the deepest part of the stream. They were, however, carried down so swiftly by the current that they were brought quite near to the point of rushes where our travellers lay concealed, so near that their voices could be distinctly heard. They talked in Portuguese. Antonio muttered a few words, and Harold observed that there was a good deal of excitement in the looks of his men. "What's the matter?" he asked anxiously. Antonio shook his head. "Dat nigger goin' to be drownded," he said. "Bad nigger. Obstropolous nigger, s'pose." "What!" exclaimed Disco in a whisper. "Goin' to be drownded? What d'ye mean?" Antonio proceeded to explain that it was a custom amongst the Portuguese slave owners there, when they found any of their slaves intractable or refractory, to hire some individuals who, for a small sum, would bind and carry off the incorrigible for the purpose of making away with him. One method of effecting this was to tie him in a sack and throw him into the river, the crocodiles making quite sure that the unfortunate being should never again be seen, either alive or dead. But before Antonio had finished his brief explanation, he was interrupted by an exclamation from the horrified Englishmen, as they beheld the two men in the canoe raise something between them which for a moment appeared to struggle violently. "Shove off! Give way!" shouted Harold and Disco in the same breath, each thrusting with his paddle so vigorously that the two canoes shot out like arrows into the stream. At the same instant there was a heavy plunge in the water beside the strange canoe, and the victim sank. Next moment one end of the sack rose to the surface. Both Harold and Disco made straight towards it, but it sank again, and the two murderers paddled to the shore, on which they drew up their canoe, intending to take to the bush, if necessary, for safety. Once again the sack rose not more than 3 yards from Disco's canoe. The bold seaman knew that if it disappeared a third time there would be little chance of its rising again. He was prompt in action and daring to recklessness. In one moment he had leaped overboard, dived, caught the sack in his powerful grasp, and bore it to the surface. The canoe had been steered for him. The instant he appeared, strong and ready hands laid hold of him and his burden, and dragged them both inboard. "Cut the lashin's and give him air," cried Disco, endeavouring to find his clasp knife, but one of the men quickly obeyed the order, and opened the sack. A groan of horror and pity burst from the seaman when he beheld the almost insensible form of a powerful negro, whose back was lacerated with innumerable ragged cuts, and covered with clotted blood. "Where are the—" He stopped short on looking round, and observing that the two men were standing on the shore, seized a double barrelled gun. The stream had carried the canoe a considerable distance below the spot where the murder had been attempted, but they were still within range. Without a moment's hesitation, Disco took deliberate aim at them, and fired. Fortunately for him and his party, Disco was a bad shot. Nevertheless, the bullet struck so close to the feet of the two men that it drove the sand and pebbles into their faces. They turned at once and fled, but before they reached the cover of the bushes the second barrel was fired, and the bullet whistled close enough over their heads greatly to accelerate their flight. The negroes opened their great round eyes and appeared awestruck at this prompt display of a thirst for vengeance on the part of one who had hitherto shown no other disposition than hilarity, fun, and good humour. Harold was greatly relieved to observe Disco's failure, for if he had hit either of the fugitives, the consequences might have been very disastrous to their expedition. On being partially revived and questioned, it turned out that the poor fellow had been whipped almost to death for refusing to be the executioner in whipping his own mother. This was a refinement in cruelty on the part of these professedly Christian Portuguese, which our travellers afterwards learned was by no means uncommon. We are told by those who know that region well, and whose veracity is unquestionable, that the Portuguese on the east coast of Africa live in constant dread of their slaves rising against them. No wonder, considering the fiendish cruelties to which they subject them. In order to keep them in subjection they underfeed them, and if any of them venture to steal cocoa nuts from the trees, the owners thereof are at liberty to shoot them and throw them into the sea. Slaves being cheap there and plentiful, are easily replaced, hence a cruel owner never hesitates. If a slave is refractory, and flogging only makes him worse, his master bids the overseer flog him until he will require no more. Still further to keep them in subjection, the Portuguese then endeavour to eradicate from them all sympathy with each other, and all natural affection, by the following means. If a woman requires to be flogged, her brother or son is selected to do it. Fathers are made to flog their daughters, husbands their wives, and if two young negroes of different sexes are observed to show any symptoms of growing attachment for each other, these two are chosen for each other's executioners. Note: Sea Travels in Eastern Africa, by Lyons McLeod, Esquire, F.R.G.S., and late Her Britannic Majesty's Consul at Mozambique, Volume 1, pages 274 to 277, and Volume 2, page 27. The poor wretch whom we have just described as having been saved from death, to which he had been doomed for refusing to become the executioner of his own mother, was placed as tenderly and comfortably as circumstances would admit of in the bottom of the canoe, and then our travellers pushed on with all haste, anxious to pass the town before the two fugitives could give the alarm. They were successful in this, probably because the two men may have hid themselves for some time in the jungle, under the impression that the exasperated Englishmen might be searching for them on shore. Giving themselves time only to take a hurried meal in the middle of the day, our travellers rowed continuously till sunset, when, deeming it probable that pursuit, if undertaken at all, must have been abandoned, they put ashore on the right bank of the river and encamped. When the sufferer had been made as comfortable as circumstances would allow, for he was much weakened by loss of blood as well as agonised with pain, and after he had been refreshed with food and some warm tea, Harold questioned him, through the interpreter, as to his previous history. At first the man was brusque in his manner, and inclined to be sulky, for a long course of cruelty had filled him with an intense hatred of white men. Indeed, an embittered and desperate spirit had begun to induce callous indifference to all men, whether white or black. But kind treatment, to which he was evidently unaccustomed, and generous diet, which was obviously new to him, had a softening influence, and when Harold poured a small glass of rum into his tea, and Antonio added a lump of sugar, and Disco pressed him tenderly to drink it of which he did, the effect was very decided. The settled scowl on his face became unsettled, and gradually melting away, was replaced by a milder and more manly look. By degrees he became communicative, and bit by bit his story was drawn from him. It was brief, but very sorrowful. His name, he said, was Chimbolo. He belonged to a tribe which lived far inland beyond the Manganja country, which latter was a country of hills. He was not a Manganja man, but he had married a Manganja woman. One night he, with his wife and mother, was paying a visit to the village of his wife's relations, when a band of slave hunters suddenly attacked the village. They were armed with guns, and at once began to murder the old people and capture the young. Resistance was useless. His relatives were armed only with bows and spears. Being taken by surprise, they all fled in terror, but were pursued, and few escaped. His wife, he said, and a scowl of terrible ferocity crossed Chimbolo's face as he said it, was about to become a mother at the time. He seized her in his arms on the first alarm, and fled with her into the bush, where he concealed her, and then hurried back to aid his relations, but met them, old and young, strong and feeble, flying for their lives. It was not possible to rally them. He therefore joined in the flight. While running, a bullet grazed his head and stunned him. Presently he recovered and rose, but in a few minutes was overtaken and captured. A slave stick was put on his neck, and along with a number of Manganja men, women, and children, he was driven down to the coast and sold, with a number of other men and women, among whom was his own mother, to a Portuguese merchant on the coast near the East Luavo mouth of the Zambesi. There he was found to be of a rebellious spirit, and at last, on positively refusing to lash his mother, his master ordered him to be whipped to death, but changing his mind before the order had been quite carried out, he ordered him to be bound hand and foot and taken away in a sack. As to his wife, he had never heard of her since that night, which was about 2 years past. He knew that she had not been found, because he had not seen her amongst the other captives. If they had found her, they would have been sure to carry her off, because here Chimbolo's visage again grew diabolical. She was young, he said, and beautiful. When all this had been translated into bad English by Antonio, Harold asked if Chimbolo thought it probable that his wife was still alive in the Manganja highlands. To this the former said that he thought it likely. "Why, then," said Disco, giving his right thigh a powerful slap, which was his favourite method of emphasising a remark, "what d'ye say, sir, to lay our course for these same highlands, and try for to find out this poor critter?" "Just what was running in my own mind, Disco," said Harold, musing over his supper. "It does not make much difference what part of this country we go to, being all new to us, and as Antonio tells me the Manganja highlands are up the Shire river, which was explored by Dr Livingstone not long ago, and is not distant many days' journey from this, I think we can't do better than go there. We shall have a good as well as a definite object in view." "Werry good, sir, I'm agreeable," returned Disco, reaching forth his pewter plate. "Another hunk o' that potamus, Jumbo. It's better than salt junk any day. And I say, Jumbo, don't grin so much, else you'll enlarge your pretty little mouth, which 'ud be a pity." "Yes, sar," replied Jumbo, becoming very grave all of a sudden, but on receiving a nod and an expressive wink from the seaman, he exploded again and rolled backward on the grass, in the performance of which act he capsized Zumbo's can of tea, whereupon Zumbo leaped upon him in wrath, and Masiko, as in duty bound, came to the rescue. "Clap a stopper on your noise, will 'ee?" cried Disco sternly, "else you'll be bringin' all the wild beasts in these parts down on us to see what it's all about." "That reminds me," said Harold, when quiet was restored, that we must now organise ourselves into something of a fighting band, a company, as it were, of soldiers, and take our regular spell of watching by night, for, from all that I hear of the disturbed state of the country just now, with these runaway slaves and rebels, it will be necessary to be on our guard. Of course," he added, smiling, "I suppose I must be captain of the company, and you, Disco, shall be lieutenant." "Not at all," replied the seaman, shaking his head, and frowning at Jumbo, whose brilliant teeth at once responded to the glance. "Not at all. None o' your sodgerin' for me. I never could abide the lobsters. Fust mate, sir, that's what I am, if I'm to be expected to do my dooty." "Well, then, first mate be it," rejoined Harold, "and Antonio shall be sergeant major." "Bo'sunin," suggested Disco. "Keep up appearance whatever ye do, and don't let the memory of salt water go down." "Very good," said Harold, laughing; "then you shall be bo's'n, Antonio, as well as cook, and I will instruct you in the first part of your duty, which will be to keep watch for an hour while the rest of us sleep. My first mate will teach you the whistlin' part of a bo's'n's duty, if that should be required." "Ah, and the roar!" interrupted Disco. "A bo's'n would be nothin' without his roar." At that moment the woods around them were filled with a tremendous and very unexpected roar, which caused the whole party to spring up, and induced the new bo's'n to utter a yell of terror that would have done credit to the whistle of the most violent bo's'n on the sea. Next moment the travellers were surrounded by a large and excited band of armed negroes. CHAPTER VII. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com